The Pratt & Whitney engine of my Wildcat screamed at maximum power as I hauled back on the stick, pulling out of my dive with Japanese Zero bullets stitching the air where I'd been seconds before. Below me, Henderson Field stretched like a brown scar across the green jungle of Guadalcanal, its single dirt runway the only thing standing between American forces and complete Japanese of the Solomon Islands. My fuel gauge showed nearly empty, my ammunition counter blinked red, and somewhere above the towering cumulus clouds, 27 Japanese Betty bombers were bearing down on our makeshift airfield with enough explosive power to turn our tiny outpost into a crater. It was October 14, 1942, and I was about to discover whether the ragtag collection of Navy, Marine, and Army pilots they called the Cactus Air Force could really live up to its impossible reputation. The first thing that hits you about Guadalcanal isn't the heat or the humidity, or even the constant buzz of mosquitoes that carry malaria like flying syringes of death. It's the smell. Rotting vegetation, aviation fuel, cordite, and something else you can't quite identify until you realize it's fear mixed with determination, baked into the very earth by months of combat. That's what I breathed in as I climbed down from the transport plane that had brought me to Henderson Field in early October 1942, my sea bag slung over one shoulder and my flight helmet tucked under my arm. I was a Navy pilot fresh from flight training in Pensacola, assigned to Fighting Squadron 121 under the command of Joe Foss, though I wouldn't meet the legendary Marine ace for another 2 days. What I saw as I stepped onto that coral dust runway made me wonder if I'd live long enough to meet anyone. Henderson Field looked like something built by desperate men with whatever materials they could scrounge. The single runway, barely 3,600 feet of packed dirt and crushed coral, was pockmarked with bomb craters that ground crews had filled in with more coral and prayers. Along the edges of the field sat our aircraft, if you could call them that. Wildcats with patched wings and jury-rigged engines. Dauntless dive bombers held together with salvaged parts and the kind of mechanical innovation that comes from knowing your life depends on making broken things work. Most of the planes showed battle-damaged bullet holes covered with aluminum patches, propellers nicked by shrapnel, oil stains that told stories of emergency landings and near misses. You the new meat? The voice belonged to a Marine sergeant with grease under his fingernails and the hollow-eyed look of a man who'd been working 18-hour days for months. His name was Rodriguez, and he'd be responsible for keeping my Wildcat in the air. "Just arrived, Sergeant," I replied, trying to keep the uncertainty out of my voice. Rodriguez laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. "Well, welcome to the Cactus Air Force, Navy. Hope you're a fast learner because the Japs don't give remedial lessons." The nickname Cactus Air Force came from the radio call sign for Guadalcanal Cactus. It wasn't an official unit designation. We were a motley collection of Navy, Marine, and Army pilots thrown together by circumstance and held together by necessity. Marine Fighter Squadron 223, Marine Fighter Squadron 224, Navy Fighting Squadron 5, elements of the Army's 67th Fighter Squadron, and various other units that had been shot up, reorganized, or simply abandoned on this godforsaken island in the middle of nowhere. Our commanding officer was Colonel Joe Foss, a Marine from South Dakota, who would end up becoming America's leading ace in the Pacific with 26 confirmed kills. But in October 1942, he was just another pilot trying to figure out how to keep Japanese bombers from turning Henderson Field into a smoking hole in the ground. The situation's simple. Foss explained to me during my first briefing, held in a sandbag tent that served as our operations center. Maps covered one wall, showing the Solomon Islands chain with Guadalcanal right in the middle like a 2,500 square mile target. The Japs control everything north of here. They've got airfields on Bougainville and Rabaul packed with Zeros, Bettys, and enough pilots to keep us busy from dawn to dusk. They come down here every day, sometimes twice a day, trying to bomb this field out of existence. Our job is to stop them. He pointed to Henderson Field on the map, a tiny speck surrounded by jungle and ocean. This is the only operational runway between here and Australia. If we lose it, the Japs can reinforce their ground troops on Guadalcanal without interference. If they take Guadalcanal, they cut the supply line between the United States and Australia. If they cut that supply line, he didn't need to finish. We all knew what happened if Japan controlled the South Pacific. "How many aircraft do we have operational?" I asked. Foss checked a clipboard covered with grease stains and what looked like dried blood. "Today, 17 Wildcats, 8 Dauntlesses, and 3 Army P-400s that can't fly above 15,000 feet without their engines quitting. Tomorrow? Depends on whether Rodriguez and his miracle workers can keep the engines running and whether the Japs decide to crater our runway again." The numbers were sobering. Intelligence reports indicated that Rabaul alone housed over 150 Japanese aircraft, with more scattered across airfields throughout the northern Solomons. We were outnumbered at least 8-1, operating from a single dirt strip with no radar, limited spare parts, and fuel that had to be brought in by ship through waters crawling with Japanese submarines. But there was something else in that tent, something you couldn't quantify on a clipboard or mark on a map. It was the look in the eyes of pilots who'd been fighting against impossible odds for months and somehow kept winning. Men like Mary and Carl, who'd already shot down 11 Japanese aircraft. Captain John Smith, whose Wildcat looked like it had been through a meat grinder but still flew combat missions every day. These weren't fresh-faced kids from flight school anymore. They were combat veterans who'd learned to squeeze every advantage out of their aircraft and their training. "The Wildcat's not as fast as a Zero," Foss continued, walking over to a cutaway diagram of our primary fighter. "It can't turn as tight, and it can't climb as fast. But it's built like a tank, and it can dive like a brick. The planes are fast and maneuverable, but they're made of rice paper and prayers. One burst from our 650 caliber machine guns, and they come apart like confetti." He was right about the construction differences. Japanese aircraft prioritized speed and maneuverability over protection. A Zero weighed about 5,300 pounds fully loaded, compared to our Wildcat's 7,900 pounds. They achieved their performance by eliminating armor protection for the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, and other safety features that American aircraft designers considered essential. The trade-off meant that Japanese pilots could outfly us in a turning dogfight, but they couldn't absorb the kind of punishment our planes could dish out and take. "Tactics," Foss said, tapping the diagram, "are what keep us alive. We don't turn and burn with Zeros. We use our diving speed and our firepower. Get altitude, dive down for a high-speed pass, and get out before they can react. Hit and run. Boom and zoom. Every pilot who's tried to dogfight a Zero at low speed is either dead or lucky to be alive." That first night, I lay in my cot listening to the sounds of Henderson Field at war. Generators hummed constantly, providing power for the operations tent and the few electric lights that helped ground crews work through the night. Somewhere in the darkness, mechanics hammered dents out of aluminum skin and welded patches over bullet holes. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with jungle rot and the ever-present smoke from cooking fires. But it was the other sounds that really told the story of our situation. Every few minutes, you'd hear the distant rumble of naval gunfire as Japanese destroyers and cruisers shelled our positions from the waters around Guadalcanal. The enemy controlled the sea at night, running supplies and reinforcements down from Rabaul in high-speed runs the Marines had nicknamed the Tokyo Express. During the day, American naval forces could operate relatively safely, but when darkness fell, the waters around Guadalcanal belonged to the Imperial Japanese Navy. Around 2 a.m., the shelling stopped, and an eerie quiet settled over the field. That's when you could hear the jungle sounds of night birds calling from the dense vegetation that pressed right up to the edge of our perimeter, the rustle of wind through coconut palms, and occasionally the distant sound of Japanese voices as their patrols probed our defenses. "Can't sleep?" The voice belonged to Captain Smith, the Marine pilot with the shot-up Wildcat. He was sitting on a crate outside his tent, cleaning his pistol by the light of a kerosene lantern. "Too much noise," I replied, walking over to join him. Smith laughed quietly. "Wait until tomorrow night. After you've flown your first combat mission, you'll sleep through anything." He held up his .45 automatic, checking the action. "You ever kill anyone, Navy?" It was a direct question, and I respected him enough to give a direct answer. "No, sir." "Well, you will tomorrow, or they'll kill you. That's how it works up here." He reassembled the pistol with practiced ease. The thing to remember is that every Japanese pilot you shoot down is one less bomber that can hit our guys on the ground. Every zero you knock out of the sky is one less fighter that can strafe our ships bringing in supplies. It's not personal, it's mathematics. As if to emphasize his point, a flare burst in the sky to the west, followed by the distant rattle of machine gun fire. Japanese ground forces were probing the marine perimeter again, testing for weak spots they could exploit during the next major attack. The fighting on Guadalcanal wasn't just an air war. American ground forces were locked in a deadly struggle with Japanese infantry, artillery, and armor for control of the island itself. "How many have you shot down?" I asked. Smith was quiet for a moment, looking out at the jungle darkness. "Officially, 14 confirmed, 3 probables. Unofficially?" he shrugged. "I stopped counting after 20. What matters isn't how many you shoot down, it's how many of your squadron mates make it home each day." The next morning brought my first taste of combat flying from Henderson Field, and with it, a brutal education in the realities of aerial warfare in the Solomon Islands. The alarm that jerked me awake at 0530 hours wasn't a bell or a siren. It was Rodriguez shaking my cot hard enough to rattle my teeth. "Up and at 'em, Navy." Coast watchers report bogies inbound from Bougainville. Big formation, maybe 30 aircraft. ETA 45 minutes. Coast watchers were Australian and British operatives left behind on Japanese-occupied islands throughout the Solomons. Hidden in the jungle with radio equipment, they provided our only early warning system, reporting Japanese aircraft formations as they passed overhead on their way south to Henderson Field. Without them, we'd have been sitting ducks, caught on the ground every time the enemy decided to pay us a visit. I rolled out of my cot and grabbed my flight gear helmet, goggles, oxygen mask, pistol, and the Mae West life jacket that might keep me alive if I had to ditch in the shark-infested waters around Guadalcanal. Outside, Henderson Field was coming alive with the controlled chaos of combat preparation. Ground crews swarmed over aircraft, checking fuel levels, ammunition loads, and engine oil. Pilots stumbled toward the operations tent for a quick briefing before takeoff. "Listen up," Colonel Foss announced as we crowded around the map table. Coast watchers report 27 Betty bombers escorted by 18 Zeros, heading south from Bougainville. Flight time from there to here is about 2 hours, which gives us maybe 40 minutes to get airborne and gain altitude. He traced the expected flight path with his finger, a line that ran southeast from the major Japanese air base at Bougainville, down through the slot, the narrow stretch of water between the Solomon Islands that both sides used as a highway for aircraft and ships. They'll probably come in at about 15,000 feet, maybe higher if they're feeling cautious. We'll intercept them here, about 20 miles northwest of Henderson, before they can line up for their bombing run. The tactical situation was challenging. Japanese Betty bombers, Mitsubishi G4M aircraft that could carry 1,764 pounds of bombs or torpedoes, were fast and heavily armed. Each bomber carried a crew of 7 and defensive armament that included 4 machine guns and a 20mm cannon in the tail. In formation, they could put up a wall of defensive fire that could shred attacking fighters. But the Bettys had the same construction philosophy as Japanese fighter aircraft. Speed and payload took priority over crew protection and damage resistance. American pilots had nicknamed them flying Zippo lighters because they burned so easily when hit. The fuel tanks weren't self-sealing, and there was minimal armor protection for the crew compartments. "We've got 14 Wildcats operational this morning," Foss continued. "I'll lead the 1st Division of 4 aircraft. Smith, you take the 2nd Division. Navy, you're flying wing on Smith." He looked directly at me. "Stay close to your leader, follow his lead, and don't try to be a hero. Your job is to protect Smith's 6 while he lines up his shots." The tactical doctrine was simple and deadly effective. The Wildcats would climb to 18,000 feet, positioning ourselves above and to one side of the expected bomber formation. When the Japanese aircraft appeared, we'd roll over into high-speed diving attacks, using our superior diving speed to close the distance before the Zero escorts could react. Hit the bombers hard and fast, then use our diving speed to escape before the more maneuverable Zeros could bring their superior turning ability into play. 20 minutes later, I was strapping myself into the cockpit of Wildcat number 23. a battle-scarred F4F that Rodriguez had somehow coaxed back into fighting condition despite a fuselage that looked like Swiss cheese. The Grumman F4F Wildcat wasn't the prettiest aircraft in the American inventory, but it was tough, reliable, and packed enough firepower to knock down anything the Japanese could put in the air. 650 caliber Browning machine guns were mounted in the wings, 3 per side, with 240 rounds per gun. That gave me about 20 seconds of sustained fire, which meant every burst had to count. The guns were harmonized to converge at 300 yards, close enough to guarantee hits, far enough to avoid flying through the debris when your target came apart. "Engine start," Rodriguez called out, and I hit the starter switch. The Wright R-1830 radial engine coughed, wheezed, and then roared to life with a sound like controlled thunder. 1,400 horsepower of American engineering, turning a 3-bladed Hamilton standard propeller that could pull the Wildcat through the air at over 300 miles per hour in level flight. All around Henderson Field, other Wildcats were starting their engines, the combined sound echoing off the jungle like the world's most dangerous orchestra warming up. I ran through my pre-flight checks of oil pressure, fuel quantity, ammunition counters, radio frequency, oxygen flow rate. Everything looked good, or as good as it ever looked on Guadalcanal. "Cactus flight. This is Cactus leader," Colonel Foss's voice crackled through my headphones. "Radio check over." One by one, the other pilots checked in. 12 voices confirming they were ready to defend Henderson Field against whatever the Japanese Empire could throw at us. I was Cactus 1-4, 4th Aircraft in the 1st Division, flying wing on Captain Smith. "Cactus flight, taxi for takeoff," Foss ordered. The takeoff from Henderson Field was always an adventure. The runway was too short, the surface too rough, and the aircraft too heavily loaded for comfort. But somehow, the Wildcats always managed to claw their way into the air, usually with just enough runway left to avoid plowing into the jungle at the far end. I held formation as we climbed away from Guadalcanal, the green jungle shrinking below us as we gained altitude and turned northwest toward the interception point. At 10,000 feet, I switched to oxygen and checked my gun switches one more time. Armed and ready. At 15,000 feet, we leveled off and began our patrol pattern, 4 divisions of Wildcats spread across 10 miles of sky, waiting for the Japanese formation to appear. The ocean below us was a deep blue that looked almost black, broken only by the white caps of waves and the occasional dark shadow that might have been a whale or a submarine. "Cactus leader, this is Black Base," the radio crackled with the voice of our ground controller. "Coast Watcher reports bogies passing over Vela La Vela, heading your way. Bearing 330, altitude 15,000, 20 miles out." I squinted northwest, looking for the telltale glint of sunlight on metal that would reveal the approaching enemy formation. The sky seemed empty, just endless blue broken by scattered cumulus clouds that could hide an entire air armada. Then I saw them. First, just tiny specks against the blue, so small they might have been dust on my goggles. But they were moving, growing larger by the second, resolving into the unmistakable shapes of aircraft in formation. 27 Betty bombers in 3 precise V formations with 18 Zero fighters spread above and around them like a protective umbrella. "Tally-ho," Foss's voice cut through the radio static. "Bandits, 12 o'clock level. 27 bombers with fighter escort. Cactus flight. This is it. Let's go hunting." The next few minutes unfolded with the strange time distortion that combat pilots know well. Some moments stretched out like hours, others compressed into heartbeats. I watched Foss roll his Wildcat over into a diving attack, followed by the other aircraft in his division. Captain Smith woggled his wings, the signal for our division to follow suit. I pushed the stick forward and followed Smith into the dive, my Wildcat accelerating rapidly as we plunged toward the Japanese formation. The airspeed indicator climbed past 300 miles per hour, then 350, then 400. The wind noise became a howl, and the controls grew heavy as aerodynamic forces tried to tear the aircraft apart. Below us, the Japanese formation maintained its steady course toward Henderson Field, apparently unaware of our approach. The Betty bombers were beautiful aircraft in their own way, sleek, purposeful, and deadly. Each one carried enough explosives to crater our runway and destroy half the aircraft on Henderson Field. At 1,000 yards, Smith opened fire. 6 streams of tracers reached out from his Wildcat toward the nearest Betty bomber, the bullets looking like glowing beads on a string as they arced through the air. I was still too far out for an effective shot, but I could see Smith's tracers converging on the bomber's right engine. At 500 yards, I lined up my gun sight on another Betty and squeezed the trigger. The Wildcat shuddered as 650 caliber machine guns opened up simultaneously, sending 60 rounds per second toward my target. The sound was indescribable, like the world's largest zipper being opened at high speed. My tracers walked across the Betty's wing route, and suddenly the bomber's right engine erupted in flames. The aircraft rolled over and began its death spiral toward the ocean, trailing black smoke and pieces of debris. Through my earphones, I could hear Smith whooping with excitement as his target also began to burn. But there was no time to celebrate. The Zero escorts had spotted our attack and were diving down toward us like angry hornets. I could see the muzzle flashes from their guns as they opened fire, and Smith's Wildcat suddenly sprouted a line of holes along its fuselage. "Brake right," Smith called over the radio, and I hauled back on the stick and rolled right, pulling so many G's that my vision started to narrow and my oxygen mask felt like it was trying to crush my face. A Zero flashed past my canopy, so close I could see the pilot's helmet and the red meatball insignia on the aircraft's wings. This was what they'd warned us about in training, the turning dogfight where Japanese aircraft held every advantage. The Zero could outturn, outclimb, and outmaneuver our Wildcat in any contest of agility. But it couldn't outdive us, and it couldn't absorb the kind of punishment our aircraft were designed to take. I rolled the Wildcat over and dove for the deck, using gravity and my aircraft's superior weight to build up speed that the lighter Zero couldn't match. Behind me, I could hear the chatter of machine gun fire as other Wildcats tangled with Zero fighters throughout the area. Someone was screaming over the radio, whether from excitement, fear, or pain, I couldn't tell. At 5,000 feet, I leveled out and looked around for Smith. His Wildcat was about a mile to my east, trailing a thin stream of white vapor that indicated a coolant leak. But he was still flying, still fighting, and as I watched, he lined up another shot at a straggling Betty bomber. The bomber formation was in chaos. At least 6 of the Bettys were either shot down or burning, their precise V formations scattered across 10 miles of sky as the surviving aircraft tried to evade our attacks. The Zero escorts were engaged in individual dogfights with our Wildcats, unable to provide coordinated protection for the bombers they were supposed to defend. I spotted a damaged Betty trying to limp back toward Bougainville, flying alone and low over the water. Its left engine was smoking, and I could see holes in its wings where someone had already hit it. This was my chance for a clean, uncomplicated shot at an enemy aircraft that couldn't maneuver effectively. I angled my Wildcat toward the fleeing bomber, adjusting my approach to attack from its blind spot beneath the tail. At 800 yards, I could see the rear gunner swiveling his 20mm cannon toward me, but I was already committed to the attack. At 400 yards, I opened fire. My tracers converged on the Betty's fuselage just behind the wing root, where the fuel tanks were located. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the entire aircraft disappeared in a ball of orange flame that expanded outward like a miniature sun. The explosion was so violent that debris peppered my Wildcat's canopy, and I had to dive away to avoid flying into the wreckage. When I looked back, there was nothing left of the bomber except scattered pieces falling toward the ocean and a column of black smoke rising toward the clouds. My first confirmed kill. The entire engagement lasted maybe 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. By the time the surviving Japanese aircraft, about half the original formation, turned northwest and headed for home, Henderson Field was safe for another day. We'd broken up their bombing attack, shot down at least 12 bombers and 6 fighters, and sent the rest limping back to Bougainville with battle damage and demoralized crews. But victory came at a cost. 2 of our Wildcats didn't make it back to Henderson Field. Lieutenant Baker's aircraft took a direct hit from a Zero's 20mm cannon and exploded in midair, killing him instantly. Ensign Rodriguez No relation to my crew chief, and managed to bail out of his burning Wildcat, but was never found despite extensive search efforts. As I taxied my shot-up Wildcat back to its revetment, I could see the ground crews already warming up to assess the damage and begin repairs. My aircraft had taken 14 hits, mostly small-caliber machine gun rounds that had punched holes in non-critical areas. But one 20mm cannon shell had passed through the engine compartment, missing vital components by inches. Rodriguez met me as I climbed out of the cockpit, his grease-stained coveralls already soaked with sweat despite the early hour. How'd she handle Navy? Like a dream, Sergeant. She brought me home. He nodded, running his hands along the bullet holes in the fuselage. She'll fly again tomorrow, assuming I can find enough aluminum patches and some spare wiring. You get any of them? I held up 2 fingers. 2 Bettys confirmed. Rodriguez grinned, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since arriving at Henderson Field. Not bad for your first day in the neighborhood. Stick around long enough, and you might even get good at this. But as I walked toward the operations tent for debriefing, I couldn't stop thinking about Baker and Rodriguez, 2 pilots who'd woken up that morning expecting to fly another mission and go to sleep in their own cots. Instead, they were gone, disappeared into the vast blue Pacific that surrounded Guadalcanal like a watery grave. This was the reality of the Cactus Air Force. We flew, we fought, we died, and we did it again the next day because the alternative was letting the Japanese bomb Henderson Field into rubble and abandon Guadalcanal to enemy occupation. Every mission was a roll of the dice, every takeoff a gamble with death, every landing a small victory against impossible odds. And somehow, against all logic and probability, we were winning. The next 3 weeks blurred together into a continuous cycle of combat missions, emergency repairs, and sleepless nights punctuated by Japanese naval bombardments. The pattern was always the same. Coast watchers would report incoming aircraft. We'd scramble whatever Wildcats could still fly, intercept the formation over the waters northwest of Guadalcanal, and fight a running battle back toward Henderson Field. Some days we got lucky and caught the Japanese formations by surprise, shooting down bombers before their fighter escorts could react effectively. Other days, the Zeros were waiting for us at altitude, and we'd find ourselves in desperate dogfights over the jungle canopy, while enemy bombers worked over our airfield with methodical precision. The Japanese were learning, adapting their tactics to counter our hit and run strategies. They started bringing more fighter escorts, sometimes 2 or 3 Zeros for every bomber. They varied their approach routes, altitudes, and timing to keep us guessing. Worst of all, they began launching night attacks with float planes and twin-engine bombers that could navigate by moonlight and drop their bombs on Henderson Field while most of our fighters were grounded by darkness. But we were learning too. Colonel Foss developed new tactics that maximized our aircraft strengths while minimizing exposure to Japanese advantages. Instead of single diving passes, we began coordinating attacks from multiple angles, forcing the Zero escorts to split their attention and leaving gaps in their defensive coverage. We started using the clouds more effectively, hiding above the overcast until the last possible moment before diving down on unsuspecting formations. Most importantly, we learned to trust each other completely. In air combat, hesitation kills you faster than enemy bullets. When your wingman calls for a break, you break immediately without looking around to see what's shooting at you. When your leader rolls over into an attack, you follow him down even if it looks like suicide. The survival of the entire squadron depends on that kind of instant, unquestioning trust. On October 23rd, that trust saved my life. We were flying our second mission of the day, a patrol northwest of Henderson Field after coast watchers reported a large formation of Japanese aircraft assembling over Bougainville. Intelligence suggested this might be a major effort, possibly involving more than 50 bombers and fighters, intended to finally knock Henderson Field out of the war permanently. I was flying wing on Captain Smith again, my usual position in the 2nd Division. After 3 weeks of combat flying, Smith and I had developed the kind of wordless communication that keeps both pilots alive in a hostile sky. A slight wing woggle meant, check your 6. A shallow turn meant, bandits in that direction. A sharp roll followed by a dive meant, follow me down and shoot at whatever I'm shooting at. At 18,000 feet, Cruising in loose formation about 30 miles northwest of Guadalcanal, we spotted them. Not the usual formation of 20 or 30 aircraft, but a massive aerial armada that stretched across miles of sky. 43 Betty bombers in multiple formations, escorted by 38 Zero fighters arranged in a complex defensive pattern that looked like an aerial fortress. Someone whispered over the radio, and I had to agree with the sentiment. In 3 weeks of combat flying, I'd never seen so many Japanese aircraft in one place. The combined formation probably represented half the aircraft available to Japanese forces in the Northern Solomons, a maximum effort designed to destroy Henderson Field once and for all. Cactus leader to all Cactus flights, Colonel Foss's voice cut through the radio chatter with calm authority. I count approximately 80 bandits inbound to Henderson. We're outnumbered almost 6 to 1, gentlemen, but we've got altitude advantage and the element of surprise. Attack the bombers first. Ignore the fighters unless they're shooting at you personally. 16 Wildcats against 80 Japanese aircraft. The mathematics were sobering, but we didn't have a choice. If that bomber formation reached Henderson Field and delivered their ordnance accurately, there might not be an airfield left to defend. Foss rolled over and began his diving attack, followed by the other 3 aircraft in his division. Smith woggled his wings, signaling our division to follow suit. I pushed the stick forward and felt the familiar sensation of acceleration as the Wildcat gathered speed in its powered dive toward the Japanese formation. At 2,000 yards, I could see individual aircraft clearly, the sleek lines of Betty bombers, the distinctive silhouettes of Zero fighters, the glint of sunlight on polished metal. At 1,000 yards, the formation looked huge, filling my entire field of vision like a flying city made of aluminum and high explosives. At 500 yards, Smith opened fire on the lead Betty bomber in the nearest V formation. His tracers reached out across the gap and walked along the bomber's fuselage from nose to tail. I selected a Betty in the same formation and squeezed my own trigger, watching 6 streams of 50 caliber bullets converge on the aircraft's right engine nacelle. The result was immediate and spectacular. The engine exploded in a gush of flame and oil, and the Betty rolled over and began its death dive toward the ocean. But before I could line up another target, the Zero escorts reacted with terrifying efficiency. Suddenly, the sky around me was full of Japanese fighters, their wings twinkling with muzzle flashes as they opened fire. Bullets sparked off my armor plating and punched holes in my wings. My canopy cracked from a near miss, and I could smell the acrid smoke of burning electrical wiring somewhere in the cockpit. "Brake right," Smith's voice cut through the chaos over the radio. I hauled the stick over and rolled right as hard as I could, pulling so many G's that my vision tunneled down to a narrow circle directly in front of me as Zero flashed through the space where I'd been a second earlier, its gun still firing. But I'd broken right into the sights of another Zero that I hadn't seen. The Japanese pilot had anticipated my evasive maneuver perfectly, positioning himself for a deflection shot as I rolled out of my turn. At 200 yards, there was no way he could miss. That's when Smith appeared out of nowhere, his Wildcat diving vertically down from above at maximum speed. His 6 guns opened up simultaneously, and the Zero that was about to kill me simply disintegrated under the impact of 30 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. Pieces of the Japanese fighter scattered in all directions, and the pilot's parachute never opened. "Thanks, Skipper," I managed to gasp over the radio as I rolled back into formation with Smith. "Save the gratitude for later, Navy," he replied, already lining up another shot at a damaged Betty bomber. "We've still got work to do." The air battle raged for 20 minutes across 50 miles of sky, from the initial interception point all the way back to Henderson Field itself. The Japanese formation, disrupted by our initial attack, had broken up into smaller groups of bombers trying to reach their target while their fighter escorts tangled with our Wildcats in individual dogfights. We couldn't stop all of them. Despite our best efforts, about 15 Betty bombers managed to reach Henderson Field and drop their bombs on the runway, taxiways, and aircraft revetments. From 18,000 feet, I watched explosions blossom across the airfield like deadly flowers, and columns of black smoke rose into the tropical air. But we'd broken the back of their maximum effort. 28 Japanese bombers never made it home to Bougainville, shot down by Wildcat pilots who refused to be intimidated by impossible odds. The escort fighters lost 14 aircraft, including several piloted by experienced aces who couldn't be easily replaced. More importantly, we'd proven that the Cactus Air Force couldn't be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The Japanese had thrown everything they had at Henderson Field, and we were still there, still flying, still fighting. After October 23rd, they never again attempted such a massive daylight raid against Guadalcanal. When I landed back at Henderson Field, the runway was cratered and smoking, but it was still operational. Ground crews were already filling in bomb craters with coral and dirt, while mechanics worked frantically to repair aircraft damaged by bomb fragments and strafing attacks. Rodriguez met me at my revetment, but for once, his usual sardonic grin was replaced by something approaching respect. "Heard you boys broke up the whole Air Force up there," he said, examining the bullet holes in my Wildcat's wings. "They got through to the field," I replied, looking at the smoke still rising from damaged buildings and aircraft. Rodriguez shrugged. "They got through, but they didn't knock us out. Tomorrow morning, we'll still be here, and so will you. That's what matters in this business." He was right. Despite the damage, Henderson Field was still operational. The runway could be repaired overnight, the destroyed aircraft could be replaced, and the pilots who'd been shot down could be rescued or replaced by fresh blood from the States. But the Japanese couldn't easily replace the experienced air crews they'd lost, or the aircraft that had been scattered in pieces across the Solomon Sea. That night, as I lay in my cot listening to the sounds of repair work and the distant rumble of naval gunfire, I realized that something fundamental had changed in the air war over Guadalcanal. We weren't just surviving anymore, we were winning. The Japanese had shot their bolt, thrown their best punch, and we were still standing. From this point forward, every day that Henderson Field remained operational was another day that Japanese forces on Guadalcanal went without adequate air support, another day that American ships could bring in reinforcements and supplies, another day closer to ultimate victory in the Solomon Islands. But the cost of that victory was written in empty cots and vacant places at the mess table. Of the 16 pilots who'd taken off that morning, only 12 had returned. 4 more names to add to the growing list of men who died defending this godforsaken strip of coral and dirt in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. By early November 1942, the character of the air war over Guadalcanal had fundamentally shifted. What had begun as desperate defensive actions by an outnumbered and undersupplied Air Force had evolved into systematic offensive operations designed to destroy Japanese air power throughout the Solomon Islands chain. The change wasn't immediately obvious to those of us flying daily combat missions from Henderson Field. We still faced the same routine dawn alerts, hasty briefings, scrambles to intercept incoming raids, and fierce dogfights over jungle and ocean. But the numbers were telling a different story. Japanese formations were getting smaller, their attacks less frequent, and their pilots noticeably less aggressive in combat. The reason became clear during a briefing on November 8th, when Colonel Foss showed us reconnaissance photographs taken over Rabaul, the major Japanese air base in the northern Solomons. Where intelligence reports had once indicated more than 150 operational aircraft, the photos showed empty revetments, burned hangars, and aircraft graveyards filled with the twisted wreckage of planes that would never fly again. "Gentlemen," Foss announced, spreading the photos across the table in our operations tent, "we've been more successful than we realized. Intelligence estimates that Japanese air strength in the northern Solomons has been reduced by approximately 60% since the beginning of October. They're running out of aircraft, and more importantly, they're running out of experienced pilots." The statistics were staggering. In 6 weeks of continuous combat operations, the Cactus Air Force had shot down 268 confirmed Japanese aircraft while losing 85 of our own. But the raw numbers didn't tell the whole story. Japanese pilot training programs couldn't replace experienced aircrews fast enough to maintain operational effectiveness, while American training facilities were producing new pilots in ever-increasing numbers. More significantly, Japanese aircraft production was beginning to show the strain of a war economy stretched across the entire Pacific. Each Zero or Betty bomber shot down over Guadalcanal represented not just the loss of an aircraft, but the loss of critical materials, aluminum, rubber, aviation fuel, and precision instruments that couldn't be easily replaced. Our mission is changing, Foss continued, pointing to a map that showed the entire Solomon Islands chain. Instead of just defending Henderson Field, we're going to start taking the offensive. Beginning tomorrow, we'll be conducting fighter sweeps over Japanese airfields, attacking their aircraft on the ground, and intercepting their supply runs before they can reach their forward bases. The transition from defensive to offensive operations marked a new phase in my combat experience. Instead of waiting for the Japanese to come to us, we were taking the fight directly to them, striking at their bases, supply lines, and reinforcement routes with a kind of sustained air campaign that would become the model for future Pacific operations. My first offensive mission came on November 12th, a fighter sweep over the Japanese seaplane base at Rakata Bay, about 150 miles northwest of Henderson Field. Intelligence reported that the enemy was using the base to stage reconnaissance flights and night bombing attacks against our positions on Guadalcanal. 8 Wildcats took off from Henderson Field at dawn, loaded with fuel and ammunition for what would be a 3-hour mission deep into enemy-controlled territory. I was flying wing on Captain Smith again, our partnership now seasoned by weeks of combat flying and mutual trust built under fire. The flight north took us over waters that had seen some of the most intense naval battles of the Pacific War. Below us, the wrecks of American and Japanese warships dotted the ocean floor in an underwater graveyard that sailors had nicknamed Iron Bottom Sound. Every few miles, we'd spot debris floating on the surface, life rafts, empty fuel drums, pieces of hull plating from ships that would never return to port. At 100 miles out, we began our descent toward Rakata Bay, approaching the target area at low altitude to avoid detection by Japanese radar installations. The seaplane base appeared ahead of us exactly as described in the intelligence briefing, a natural harbor protected by coral reefs, with a cluster of support buildings, fuel storage tanks, and aircraft moorings arranged along the shoreline. And sitting at anchor in the bay were 12 Japanese seaplanes, Konishi H-6K flying boats that the Allies had nicknamed Mavis. Each aircraft was capable of carrying 2,200 pounds of bombs or torpedoes, with enough range to strike targets as far away as Australia. Eliminating them would significantly reduce Japanese capability to conduct long-range reconnaissance and bombing missions throughout the South Pacific. Cactus leader to all flights, came Smith's voice over the radio as he assumed tactical command of the formation. Target in sight. 4 aircraft, each on the seaplanes, fuel storage, and support facilities. Make your passes count, gentlemen. We won't get a second chance. The attack unfolded with the precision of a well-rehearsed drill. The first 4 Wildcats dove on the anchored seaplanes, their 50 caliber machine guns stitching lines of destruction across the flying boats' hulls and fuel tanks. Within seconds, 3 of the Mavis aircraft were burning furiously, the aviation fuel creating pillars of black smoke that rose hundreds of feet into the tropical air. My division attacked the fuel storage facility, a cluster of cylindrical tanks connected by a maze of pipelines and pumping equipment. At 500 yards, I opened fire on the largest tank, watching my tracers converge on the thin aluminum skin. The result was immediate and catastrophic. The tank exploded with a roar that could be heard above the sound of our engines, sending a mushroom cloud of flame and debris high into the sky. The entire attack lasted less than 5 minutes, but when we pulled away from Rakata Bay and headed south toward Henderson Field, the Japanese seaplane base was completely destroyed. 12 aircraft eliminated, fuel supplies destroyed, support facilities reduced to smoldering rubble. It would be months before the base could be rebuilt and made operational again. But perhaps more importantly, the raid demonstrated that Japanese positions throughout the Solomons were no longer safe from American air attack. We could strike anywhere, anytime, with devastating effectiveness. The psychological impact on enemy morale was probably as significant as the physical destruction we'd caused. Flying home over the same waters that had carried us north, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed since that first desperate scramble in early October. Then we'd been fighting for survival, hoping to last long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Now we were carrying the war to the enemy, systematically destroying their capability to threaten American positions throughout the South Pacific. The transformation wasn't just tactical, It was personal. The nervous replacement pilot who'd arrived at Henderson Field 6 weeks earlier no longer existed. In his place was a combat veteran with 8 confirmed kills, a collection of medals he never had time to think about, and the kind of hard-won confidence that comes from surviving when survival seems impossible. Over the next 2 weeks, the pace of offensive operations accelerated dramatically. Fighter sweeps over Japanese airfields became daily occurrences, often coordinated with dive-bombing attacks by our dauntless squadrons. We struck targets throughout the northern Solomons of Buin, Balali, Kahili, and Bougainville itself, systematically destroying aircraft, fuel supplies, ammunition dumps, and support facilities. The Japanese response was increasingly desperate. Unable to mount effective daylight raids against Henderson Field, they resorted to night attacks by individual aircraft and small formations. Float planes would appear over our positions after midnight, dropping random bombs and harassing our ground forces with nuisance raids designed more to prevent sleep than cause significant damage. But even these minor irritations were gradually eliminated as we developed night fighting capabilities. Marine and Navy night fighter pilots, flying specially equipped Wildcats with radar and enhanced instruments, began intercepting Japanese intruders in the darkness over Guadalcanal. The hunters had become the hunted. By November 25th, Japanese air attacks against Henderson Field had virtually ceased. The last major daylight raid occurred on November 20th, when 18 Betty bombers escorted by 12 Zeros attempted to bomb our fuel storage areas. We intercepted the formation 30 miles northwest of Guadalcanal and shot down 14 bombers and 8 fighters without losing a single American aircraft. The pilot who'd led that interception was Captain Smith, flying his 75th combat mission from Henderson Field. His Wildcat that day carried victory markings for 19 confirmed kills, making him one of the leading American aces in the Pacific theater. But more importantly to me, he'd been my squadron leader, mentor, and wingman through 6 weeks of the most intensive air combat in American military history. 3 days later, Smith's luck finally ran out. November 28th dawned clear and hot, with the kind of brilliant tropical sunshine that made flying a pure joy when you weren't being shot at. We'd been scheduled for a routine patrol, 4 Wildcats flying reconnaissance over the waters northwest of Guadalcanal, looking for Japanese ships or aircraft that might threaten our positions. It should have been an easy mission. Intelligence reports indicated minimal enemy activity in our patrol area, and we'd been briefed to expect nothing more challenging than a few scattered clouds and maybe some flying fish breaking the surface of the Solomon Sea. I was flying wing on Smith as usual, our 2 Wildcats cruising in loose formation at 12,000 feet, while the other pair patrolled at a different altitude 10 miles away. The radio chatter was relaxed, almost casual, pilots commenting on the weather, the view, the condition of their aircraft. After weeks of desperate combat flying, a peaceful reconnaissance mission felt almost like a vacation. That's when we spotted the lone Japanese aircraft. It was a single Betty bomber, flying low and fast toward Guadalcanal from the northwest. At first glance, it looked like a reconnaissance flight or maybe a damaged aircraft trying to reach safety. But something about its flight path struck Smith as suspicious. "Navy, do you see anything unusual about that bogey?" Smith asked over the radio. I studied the distant aircraft through my binoculars, trying to identify what had caught his attention. The Betty was flying lower than normal, maybe 500 feet above the water, and its course seemed to be taking it directly toward Henderson Field. But more significantly, it wasn't broadcasting any identification signals or attempting to communicate with our ground controllers. "Looks like he's trying to sneak in under our radar coverage," I replied. "Could be a photo reconnaissance mission, or maybe he's carrying some kind of special weapon." Smith was quiet for a moment, considering the possibilities. A lone Japanese aircraft approaching Henderson Field at low altitude could be carrying anything from cameras to commandos to a single large bomb intended for a suicide attack. Whatever its mission, we couldn't let it reach Guadalcanal unopposed. "Let's go check it out," Smith decided, rolling his Wildcat over into a shallow dive toward the unidentified aircraft. "Stay loose and watch for escorts." This could be a trap. As we descended toward the lone Betty, I kept my eyes moving constantly, scanning the sky for additional Japanese aircraft that might be using the bomber as bait to lure American fighters into an ambush. but the sky seemed empty except for the 3 aircraft now converging over the blue waters of the Solomon Sea. At 2 miles, the Betty's pilot spotted us and immediately began evasive maneuvers, jinking left and right while maintaining his low altitude above the wave tops. The aircraft was definitely on a hostile mission. No friendly or neutral aircraft would maneuver so aggressively to avoid contact with American fighters. Cactus Base, this is Cactus 2-1, Smith radioed to our ground controllers. We have one hostile bomber attempting to penetrate our airspace at low level. Moving to intercept. The response crackled back immediately. Cactus 2-1, you are cleared to engage. Splash that bogey before he reaches the field. Smith rolled out of his turn about 1,000 yards behind the fleeing Betty, perfectly positioned for a classic stern attack. The Japanese bomber was trapped at low altitude with nowhere to maneuver except left or right, while our Wildcats had superior speed and firepower. It should have been a textbook interception. But as Smith opened fire, the Betty's rear gunner responded with devastating accuracy. I watched in horror as the Japanese 20mm cannon found its mark, raking Smith's Wildcat from propeller to tail with a sustained burst that shattered his canopy, holed his engine, and set his fuel tank on fire. His aircraft immediately began trailing thick black smoke, and I could see flames licking around the cockpit area. "Skipper, you're on fire!" I shouted over the radio. "Bail out! Bail out!" But Smith wasn't finished fighting. Instead of abandoning his burning aircraft, he pressed home his attack on the Betty bomber, closing to point-blank range and triggering a sustained burst that walked his .50 caliber tracers from the bomber's tail to its cockpit. The Japanese aircraft shuddered under the impact, rolled over, and crashed into the ocean in a spectacular explosion that sent debris flying in all directions. Smith's Wildcat was also doomed. The fire in his fuel tank had spread throughout the aircraft, and his engine was losing power rapidly. But we were still 15 miles from Henderson Field, too far for a dead-stick landing even if his aircraft held together that long. "Navy, I'm not going to make it back." Smith's voice came over the radio with the calm professionalism that had marked his entire combat career. "Tell Rodriguez his engine ran perfectly right up to the end." I watched helplessly as Smith's burning Wildcat lost altitude and speed, its propeller windmilling uselessly as the fire consumed the engine compartment. At 500 feet above the water, with flames now engulfing the entire cockpit area, Smith finally triggered his parachute release and bailed out of the dying aircraft. But it was too late. The Wildcat exploded just as Smith cleared the cockpit, the blast catching him before his parachute could deploy properly. I saw his body hit the water, surrounded by burning fuel and wreckage, and then there was nothing but smoke and debris spreading across the surface of the Solomon Sea. Captain John Smith, 19 confirmed kills, 75 combat missions, and the best pilot I'd ever known, was gone. Killed by a single burst from a Japanese rear gunner who probably never knew the name of the American ace he'd shot down. I circled the crash site for 20 minutes, hoping against hope to spot Smith in the water, but there was nothing to see except oil slicks and scattered pieces of aluminum. The crash boat that responded to my radio call found only wreckage. Smith's body was never recovered. Flying back to Henderson Field alone, I tried to process what had just happened. In 6 weeks of intensive combat flying, Smith had survived dozens of aerial battles, accumulated nearly 200 hours of combat flight time, and emerged as one of the most successful fighter pilots in the Pacific Theater. He'd been recommended for the Medal of Honor, promoted twice, and was scheduled to rotate back to the States for a well-deserved rest. Instead, he died on what should have been a routine patrol, killed by a single lucky shot from an enemy gunner who'd probably been just as surprised as anyone when his bullets found their target. It was a brutal reminder that in aerial combat, survival often depends more on luck than skill, and that death can come for anyone at any time, regardless of experience or reputation. The loss of pilots like Smith was felt throughout the entire Cactus Air Force. These were the men who'd held Henderson Field during the darkest days of October, who'd taught replacement pilots how to survive in combat, and who'd developed the tactics and techniques that had turned an outnumbered defensive force into an offensive juggernaut capable of striking Japanese positions throughout the Solomon Islands. But their deaths also marked the end of an era. By late November 1942, the desperate defensive battles that had characterized the early weeks of the Guadalcanal campaign were history. Japanese air power in the Solomon Islands had been systematically destroyed, their airfields rendered inoperative, and their ability to support ground forces on Guadalcanal reduced to insignificance. Henderson Field, once a beleaguered outpost surrounded by enemy forces, had become the hub of American air operations throughout the South Pacific. Additional runways had been constructed, permanent facilities built, and squadrons of new aircraft, including the revolutionary Corsair fighters that would dominate the skies for the remainder of the Pacific War, were beginning to arrive in increasing numbers. The Cactus Air Force had accomplished its mission. Not only had we prevented the Japanese from taking Guadalcanal, but we'd established American air superiority throughout the Solomon Islands chain and demonstrated that Japanese forces could be defeated in sustained combat operations. The lessons learned over Henderson Field would be applied in subsequent campaigns from the Marshall Islands to the Philippines, contributing directly to ultimate victory in the Pacific War. But victory had come at a terrible cost. Of the original pilots who defended Henderson Field during October and November 1942, fewer than half survived the campaign. Men like Smith, Baker, Rodriguez, and dozens of others had paid with their lives to establish the foothold that would eventually carry American forces across the Pacific to Tokyo Bay. I rotated back to the States in December 1942, after completing 93 combat missions from Henderson Field. My final tally was 12 confirmed kills, 8 probables, and enough battle damage to my various aircraft to build several complete Wildcats from the spare parts. Like most Cactus Air Force veterans, I was exhausted, underweight, and suffering from what military doctors now recognize as combat stress reaction. But I was alive, which was more than could be said for too many of my squadron mates. 50 years later, as I write this account of those desperate weeks in the Solomon Islands, the statistics of our campaign make for impressive reading. The Cactus Air Force shot down 427 confirmed Japanese aircraft, while losing 101 of our own, a kill ratio of better than 4-1 that contributed directly to Japanese defeat in the Guadalcanal campaign and throughout the South Pacific. More significantly, we'd broken the myth of Japanese invincibility in the air. The Zero fighters that had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor proved vulnerable to proper tactics and determined pilots. The Betty bombers that had terrorized Allied positions throughout 1942 could be intercepted and destroyed by fighters with sufficient warning and altitude advantage. The techniques we'd developed over Henderson Field, high-speed diving attacks, coordinated multi-aircraft formations, systematic targeting of enemy airfields and supply lines became standard doctrine for American air forces throughout the Pacific War. Every major campaign from Tarawa to Okinawa employed lessons learned in the skies over Guadalcanal. But for those of us who were there, who flew those missions and fought those battles, the real significance of the Cactus Air Force lies not in statistics or strategic analysis, but in the memory of men like Captain Smith who gave their lives to hold a strip of coral and dirt in the middle of nowhere because they understood that this was where the war would be won or lost. Henderson Field still exists today, though it's now called Honiara International Airport and serves civilian aircraft rather than combat fighters. Tourists fly in from Australia and New Zealand, unaware that they're landing on a runway that was once the most contested piece of real estate in the Pacific Ocean. Sometimes when the wind is right and the light falls across the field at the same angle it did 78 years ago, I can almost hear the sound of Wright radial engines warming up for another mission, almost see the ghostly outlines of Wildcats taxiing through the coral dust toward takeoff position. But mostly, I remember the voices of pilots who never made it home, crackling through radio static as they called out enemy positions, coordinated attacks, or said goodbye to squadron mates who wouldn't be joining them for the next mission briefing. Their voices remind me that freedom isn't free, that democracy must be defended by men and women willing to pay the ultimate price for principles larger than themselves. The Cactus Air Force held the line when holding the line seemed impossible. We flew outnumbered missions against overwhelming odds because someone had to, and because we understood that failure meant abandoning the Pacific to Japanese occupation. In doing so, we proved that American pilots, flying American aircraft, employing American tactics, could defeat any enemy anywhere in the world. That lesson, paid for with the blood of pilots like Captain Smith, echoes across the decades as a reminder of what free people can accomplish when their survival is at stake and their cause is just. The men who died defending Henderson Field didn't live to see VJ Day or the victory parades that followed, but their sacrifice made both possible. They were the Cactus Air Force, and they held the sky when the world needed them most.